Welcome to Anchor Change, where we help you panic responsibly in a chaotic world. I'm Katie Harbath. I've navigated impossible trade-offs in tech, politics, and my personal life for decades. I know that can be lonely. As a Midwesterner who spent 20 years in Silicon Valley and DC, it's taken me a while to figure it out. I still am. One thing that helps me is hearing the stories of other people forging their own paths. Because in a world of complexity, you don't have to navigate it alone. Welcome to Anchor Change. Welcome to Anchor Change. I'm your host, Katie Harbath. Today we have Clare O'Donoghue Velikić, who is a former colleague of mine at Facebook who worked on political ads in Europe, in Dublin specifically. And she is now running her own digital agency. And there's a lot happening in Europe right now when it comes to political ads because of some new legislation that came into effect. Meta, Google, many other companies have pulled out completely and have banned political advertising there in the continent across the European Union. And so that has caused a lot of challenges for political campaigns, NGOs, nonprofits, many others who are trying to advertise. And so I wanted to have Clare on, who's been out talking about this quite a bit on places like LinkedIn and all of that, to share with us a little bit more about what is happening. And also we talk a little bit about the history of creating the political advertising ad transparency stuff. So I hope you enjoy. Clare, welcome to Anchor Change.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's really lovely to see you again.
So we both met when we were working at Facebook. You were working on ads, and I want you to explain what you were doing. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today, because there's a lot happening in the political advertising world, particularly in Europe. But can you start by just sharing a little bit about your background, what your role was at Facebook, and kind of what drew you into the world of political advertising?
Yeah, sure. So I started at Facebook. I mean, now Meta, but it was Facebook back then, and I just can't give it the new name, in early 2010, actually. And at that stage, there was no Facebook political advertising. I don't think there was even any digital political advertising in Europe at all. It just wasn't a thing. This was, Obama had kind of only just brought the concept to the US. And of course, the, US versus Europe difference is Europe is always several years behind the US in terms of what's happening with, political campaigning and digital and so on. So when I started at Facebook, I was just on the commercial ads team. I was working on, commercial advertiser accounts and so on. And then, from 2010 through sort of 2012 being kind of like the breakthrough year, obviously, for Facebook and political campaigning, still not really much had happened in Europe until it would have been early 2014. There was going to be a referendum on independence in Scotland. And apparently over in London, my team in Dublin sort of co-shared with the team in London. We were one team in two locations. Somebody had shown up at the London sales office saying, hey, can we talk to your political salesperson for the referendum in Scotland? And the sales leader was like, we've got a political salesperson here. And they showed up at the sales team that Monday morning saying, we've got these guys from the referendum. You're not going to make much money out of it, but does anybody want to do it? And I was like, me, that's right up my street. And so I ended up working on the referendum. And for the next couple of years, it was basically like a side hustle for me. It was like 20% of my time. I still had my commercial advertising book. And again, because there was, I was on a sales team, there's no revenue really coming through political advertising in Europe. It was me with 20% of my time running political ads for Europe, Middle East, and Africa for quite some time. That was the volume that was coming at that point. But then, of course, the crescendo started to grow. And then, by, I guess, sort of 2017, it probably reached peak political advertising for Facebook in Europe.
So talk us through a little bit about how Europe is different than the United States, because us in the United States, there's so much money in our elections. We're recording this the day after our US election. There's a ton of money. People are advertising all over the place. It's happening all the time, but it's very different in Europe. Can you walk through some of those main differences?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of differences. But the biggest one is, as you say, money. Most countries in Europe have pretty strict spending limits on political campaigning, both within regulated electoral periods and outside electoral periods. We just never, even if you can spend more outside of electoral periods, most political parties to date haven't been spending a huge amount online or indeed in any context. And then within a regulated period, there are fixed limits, which in most countries, I think Italy is an exception. And there's a couple of European countries that don't have the limits, but most countries do. Most countries have state funding of political parties. Sorry, I'm scratching my face. I'll say that again. So most European countries would have state funding of political parties. So there isn't the culture of fundraising as much in Europe as there would be in the US. A lot of political parties would pretty much have enough money to run their elections themselves. Then, of course, there's the cycles themselves. In the US, you've got these fixed terms. You know exactly when the elections are going to be coming up. In most countries in Europe, we don't have fixed terms. We have maximum limits, but elections are frequently called earlier or out of cycles. So you have years like, for example, 2024, tons of elections happening. We had a European Union election here in Ireland. We had a local, like council level election. And then we also had a general election all within the 1 year, which seems crazy. Now this year we've had a presidential election and now we won't have anything for another 4 years. So there isn't that sense of a cycle and a predictability to European politics that you would get in the US. And I think the other big difference certainly in terms of digital and how political campaigns operate is the data basis. The amount of data which is available to campaigns and within the digital ecosystem in the US is vast compared to what is both available and legal within the EU. And I don't want to bore everybody to death by going into the GDPR already, but the laws around data protection in Europe are something that we hold very tightly to. Most people are fans of them. It does make it a little bit frustrating when you're a campaigner and wanting to do cool things. But yeah, we kind of look at the way data is managed in the US and what can be done with data and political campaigning. And, it looks like the Wild West.
Yeah, I always would remember when I was working on campaigns still at the NRSC, the Senatorial Committee, and Germans would always come over and they're like, tell us all of your secrets and how you do everything. And so we'd start talking about data and email and fundraising. And they're like, we can't do that. We can't do that. We can't do that. And I was like,
Yeah.
I don't even know how to give you advice on what you should be doing with the fact that I always tell everyone the US is the exception, not the rule with how elections are operated and run, because in addition to everything else you just said is the fact that most of them are in a parliamentarian system, not like we have, so where there's president. So you have many more parties also in coalition building, and you're not necessarily voting for a person, you're voting for a party, which also changes campaigning as well, right?
I mean, again, that's something which differs massively even within the European Union. So here in Ireland, we have a PRS-TV system where you actually are voting for an individual, but that individual is your local member of parliament who will represent your constituency. And you'll have several. You will not have just one MP. You have 3, 4, 5 MPs representing your constituency. And then the parliament is made up of all of those members of parliament, and whoever can secure a majority from usually a coalition of multiple parties, then the leader of the biggest of those parties becomes the prime minister. So it's this slightly strange and dysfunctional system. And then we have a country like, say, France, that has, a very powerful presidency, perhaps more similar to the US. And then we have countries like the UK where, it's constituency based, but it's first past the post, so single MPs. It feels like almost every country in the EU is different. And I think the challenge that we often faced in Facebook, and I guess this is probably the case for any tech company. And this is the thing, when you have an advertising model which is set up assuming US structures, it can be, somewhat challenging to sort of translate to the local dynamics of different electoral systems in all of the different countries in Europe.
So what was that like the early days of Facebook? I'm working on my book, which has been a wild journey of kind of going back and thinking about some of those early days, because, now a lot of these tech companies, well, we're going to get into the changes that have happened, but like most people think there's big teams or they're used to having people that they can reach out to. And like you said, in those early days, it was people like you and me kind of raising our hand. And either it's because somebody was like, they're like, somebody's at the door and they need help and we don't know who to like send to them, or people raising our hands being like, hey, this is something we should be doing. Like, can we go and do it? And they're like, yeah, go do that. But we don't understand what's happening. But can you share a little bit more about what that experience was like? I go kind of early days in tech
And
and trying to.
I think there
Keep
was a
going. Yeah.
time, Kitty, where it was like you for the whole of the world apart from the US, right? Like you were
Yes.
literally,
Yeah.
whenever we could have a meeting, you'd be like, no, sorry, this week I'm in India, next week I'm in Australia. You were literally the entire world, right? Not gonna lie, it was fun. The early days were great. There was this really nice atmosphere that, everyone who we worked with was like, this is great. This is what democracy should be about, right? This is connecting with real voters, not having to go through traditional media outlets and, deal with the, perspectives of editors. I can just deliver my message straight to the people who want to hear from me. And my God, it's free. Like this, there was this really, really positive attitude. There was the whole Arab Spring movement. Here in Ireland, I think when the penny really sort of dropped about how impactful social media was for our marriage equality referendum, which, for what used to be a very conservative, traditional country like Ireland to have a very positive and exciting referendum on gay marriage and for it to be passed by popular vote. Everyone was just like, yeah, man, the world is getting better and social media is part of it. And, for us who were in the team and so on, it really felt like, oh my God, we're part of something really positive, really exciting. A little bit, as you suggest, flying by the seat of our pants. There was the expression of building the plane while flying it. And we were definitely building the plane while flying it. And I think to some extent it was that, responding to things as quickly as we could and wanting to be part of this momentum that was building, perhaps was part of the reason why we weren't adequately prepared for when the negative blowback began, because it had all been so positive for the first, couple of years or so. Everybody wanted to meet with us. Everybody was happy with what we were doing, more or less. I mean, political campaigns, everybody's a bit, stressy and so on. For me, my background before Facebook had been not in the tech world. I studied politics as part of my master's program. I had been working in sort of governmental work and nonprofits and so on. And to be honest, when I started at Facebook, I kind of had been feeling like, oh, well, I guess that part of my career is kind of over, but that's okay. I needed a job. I was like, give up with the
And there
headphones.
was this little website, and there's this little website called Facebook that you're probably like,
Right.
I don't know if your parents were this way, but like when I started in 2011, the Social Network movie had just come out, and my parents watched it to try to understand where I was going to work. And my dad, one of my parents was like, "Are you going to be ziplining?" Like, because there's that scene where they zip line from the house to the pool, and I was having to explain. I was like, "I don't think so. I think they've grown up a little bit more, but like."
Yeah,
It's hard to remember sometimes how much of a startup it was.
it really was a complete startup. And, our team was very much a startup team. Each of us came to it sort of individually and sort of going, oh, I guess we're needed to do something. So yeah, definitely flying the plane while building it.
It
And
was,
that felt
I
super
was telling
exciting when you're young and, looking to cut your teeth. And like for me, it was kind of like bringing the two strands of my career together. It felt like, oh God, this is like what I was meant to be doing. If I've got a tech background and also a politics background, here we go, the two worlds. So it was really great for like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. I couldn't believe yesterday I realized that in 2028, it will be the 20th anniversary of the Election Day reminders because they started during the Obama 2008 election. And I was
Yeah.
talking to Adam Connor, who created the first ones, and I was like, I can't believe it's going to be 20 years since we started building those, and they're still kicking. I'm hoping they're still kick for another 2 years, but we'll see. So let's go into then when things were not no longer everything we turn touch to gold, but instead we were past the 2016 election here in the United States. Brexit had happened in Europe, and there were all these questions around advertising. First in the United
Yeah.
States around Russian interference and foreign interference. Then there was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which really hit both of our US and Europe, but it was a global thing. And so we decided to build political ad transparency
Hmm.
tools where that well, before I even go into what was in it, we had to figure out what that even meant.
Hmm.
What was that post US Donald Trump winning, post-Brexit, sorry, post-November, Donald Trump winning. What
Mm.
was that like for you in Europe first?
So for me personally, the moment at which I went, uh-oh, was when I read the news about Aggregate IQ having been basically like the sort of the shell agency for Cambridge Analytica. Aggregate IQ had been my client, right? I was, again, it
Was
was
that in
just me
2015?
working.
Was that the
This was 16. This was 16.
16? Okay.
Yeah, like it was me working again, unlike in the US where there would have been like a Democrat team and a Republican team, because the diversity of perspectives in Europe and because there being so little money, it was me working, with everyone on every side and so on. And Cricket IQ had been introduced to me as my new client who would be working on the ad side for the Brexit referendum. And, when they were assigned to me, I, did a little Google of them. I had a look in their ad accounts. I could see they'd worked on Ted Cruz before and some green campaign somewhere. And I was like, well, that's an agency, normal ad agency stuff. And that was kind of it, get on with business, right? We work with ad agencies and, it's the ad agency working with the client and that's it. So then when I read in the papers that Aggregate IQ was Cambridge Analytica, and, we'd had discussions internally about, oh God, Cambridge Analytica is a threat to the business and a threat to democracy. Like what's going on here is risky stuff. But I just hadn't put two and two together, I hadn't connected the dots. And what became clear at that point was that nobody in Facebook had connected the dots. There hadn't been that sense of needing to go deep and needing to question just because you say you're somebody, are you actually representing yourself truthfully? Are you actually, who you say and doing what you're meant to do in a fully fair and transparent manner? And, it's not great if you're doing that and you're, selling crappy products online or whatever, it's not great. But if you're running elections, if you are responsible for the maintenance of democratic standards and there's a platform that's facilitating agencies or groups or whoever it might be to run ads without that level of due diligence and oversight and so on into who they actually are and what they're actually up to, who they've been hired by, etc., this is a major, major risk. And yeah, that sort of the moment where it cracked open for me and I went was the Aggregate IQ connection. And, straight from that, I do believe that the response within Facebook was, I mean, look, for sure there was a need to protect the business perspective. The tide suddenly turned, the emotional response towards the platform pivoted quite quickly at that point. And again, because we'd been on, the happy plane until then, that came as a little bit of a shock. But I think there was also a lot of people who really did recognize, okay, we screwed up here. We should have been more on top of this. We should have been, paying more attention to who was who. And yeah, foreign interference being one thing, astroturfing being another thing, so many relatively significant and poisonous elements to democracy that were able to just sneak in through the Facebook ad product and the way in which it was being bought at the time. So yeah, it was, I think the response to it was, clearly it came too late, but I think it was, I think the response from the company came with positive intent, with a genuine desire to, fix things that had gone wrong and preempt things that could potentially become more of a problem going into the future, especially foreign interference and so on. And then, of course, any public policy folks who would have been dealing with regulators would have known that there would be legislation coming in the EU in particular.
So I want a couple of things, because I think, the whole saga of Cambridge Analytica is so interesting to look back on, because there was elements where we had limited power of what we could do internally beyond flagging what we were seeing, right? To folks, like, because I remember from my end, and this is all the emails public everywhere in every court document that exists to man, where I send an email to the folks internally where I'm like, hey, we've gotten a flag about this company, Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ, and that they're making all these claims and that they got this data. And we don't think that they probably, like, we don't understand what, like, we don't think that they're supposed to have it. Is this true? Like, what should we do? Right? Like, that's all we could do. And you have to try to convince somebody internally to actually take a look at it. And then it's sort of a like, well, what do we do? All we can do is ask them to delete the data. We had no way to like make them prove that they actually did it and everything. And that all happened because Cambridge Analytica broke as a scandal March 2018 with the Guardian story and New York Times and all that. But there were stories well ahead of that
Mhm.
too that we were trying to deal with as part of it. And so that makes it challenging. And I saw it firsthand, even more challenging for those outside the United States to try to get any
Mhm.
attention on things that might be happening and trying to explain any of that to engineers who are not political, have a bunch of other things on their radar screen to try to get them to like pay attention to this kind of stuff was very hard.
Yeah, I think you make a great point about we were essentially trying to self regulate in an environment where there wasn't legislation to guide, from national governments to guide on how things should proceed. I mean, what we've seen in Europe now, literally just in the last month, the Transparency and Targeting of Political Advertising regulation, the TTPA, is basically regulating for what happened with Cambridge Analytica and with the various foreign interference activities, which we saw almost a decade ago. So as a company, we were essentially trying to come up with ways in which to remain. What's the word that I'm looking for? You can edit this bit out.
Not neutral.
We were ways in which we could make sure that we were protecting democracy without actually having a legislative framework for it, because legislation around, online advertising for politics didn't exist yet. So I do have some sympathy with their challenges that were happening internally with trying to set up protective processes and approaches, as you say, trying to get resourcing to do that and so on, both from people who didn't necessarily understand the democratic implications of it and, why it was so important for democracy, and also who didn't understand the idea that something can't necessarily scale just because it works in one particular democratic jurisdiction like the US. That it's not always going to be the same in every country globally, which, of course, most tech companies are coming up with products they want to be able to scale globally and trying to say, oh no, we need it to be a bit different here and a bit different there. And by the way, these countries don't have any money to pay for these things and so on. It was a real sort of challenge, I think, internally to get the buy-in for it.
Well, and so Cambridge Russian ads, we announced the ads, and that's actually when we started building the political ad transparency. And for folks listening, I always like to kind of put this in context because we'll start with the American context, sorry, but I do think that it's somewhat similar in a couple of other countries where traditional campaign regulations, if you will, starts with the advertiser or the candidate or the political party themselves. So it's like you are a candidate, you're a political party, you're a political entity of some sort. Thus, your ads have to have followed these rules. So, like in the United States, they have to have a disclaimer. Other places might have disclaimers. There might be periods you can't run the ads, stuff like that. Because we were trying to initially be like prevent foreign interference, it's not like the Russian Internet Research Agency was going to be like, hi, we're Russians. We're trying to run ads in the United States election or these other elections and do this. You had to start with the advertisement. So does the advertisement, is it political? And also, is it, when we defined political, it couldn't just be about a candidate or say the word election or vote or something like that, because most of the Russian ads that have been run in the United States and elsewhere had been issue based. So Black Lives Matter, immigration, stuff like that. So then we had to define what political is, which remains to this day one of the toughest things that I ever had to work on with
Mm-hmm.
that. And I remember working with you and others in Europe when we had to try to define what issues we would cover and
Mm-hmm.
what that would look like. And to your point, with no regulation from anybody, and we'd go to like the European Commission and we're like, what do you want us to do? And they're like, follow the law. And we're like, there is no law for us to follow. What, from your perspective, can you tell the story a little bit of like from what it was like when we started trying to build out these transparency tools?
Yeah, so actually my timing with all of this was um interesting in that I got to see it from the other side momentarily.
Well, that's right. When did you leave?
Well, I hadn't left Facebook yet, but in mid 2017 I went on maternity leave. So I was having my daughter.
Oh.
And I was on leave from August 2017 until pretty much the following year, same time following year, because we've got good maternity leave in Europe. So during that time, there was a referendum here in Ireland on abortion rights. Number one, it's a referendum. Number two, clearly a social issue, a contentious subject that, people are going to feel very strongly about and so on. And because I was on maternity leave, I was able to volunteer with the Yes campaign. Ordinarily, if I'd been in my job, I would have been completely neutral and so on. But since I was on leave, somebody else was doing my job. I volunteered with the campaign. And while I was on that side of it, it was the first time that Facebook brought in Europe anyway. I don't know if they might have brought something in the US already, where they brought in the ban on overseas credit cards. So it wasn't the full political ad authorization process, which was about to come. It started just with your credit card had to be an Irish credit card. And we in the Yes campaign, we're like, fine. I mean, our credit card's here. We're all here. No big deal. But we were being massively outspent by the No campaign. The No campaign had, blanketed every small town in Ireland with posters, tons and tons of ads running from all sorts of, we suspected, astroturfed, but definitely, these little small pro-life groups and so on. When Facebook brought in the credit card ban, the No ads disappeared overnight. And we were like, yes, see, we knew it wasn't all these spontaneous little Irish community groups that were doing this. And, again, I wasn't in work. I wasn't, involved in the details of drilling into who and what that was. But for sure, it was that lived experience that even something as simple as just a credit card, just starting there immediately brought a lot more focus and attention to making sure that the campaigning actually was happening within state boundaries and so on. Then by the time I got back to work in 2018, all were further down the path in working out, okay, what are all of the other elements that we needed to bring in? There was the advertisers themselves needing to be in state, which again makes a lot of sense. Harder when you come from a small country like, say, Ireland or Slovenia or somewhere, and there isn't, a political ad agency infrastructure around you. And that's before we get into the whole area of talking about NGOs and so on, which we might come back to. But again, in theory, makes sense, scales, and it's an understandable policy that seems reasonable to insist that if you're going to run political ads yourself, you're going to be the person pushing the buttons, then you should be in state and your credit card should be in state as well. So that was sort of the starting point from which we launched off there. Once you started, and again, the definition of political ads, pretty clear if you're running a political party account, if you are, representing somebody who's standing for office, makes sense, pretty clear and so on. Where we started getting into those muddy waters that you're talking about, Katie, was that whole idea of issue-based organizations, which may or may not be legitimate grassroots organizations who are just wanting to have a conversation about abortion rights, for example, or about crime rates, or whatever those issues might be, which we all knew at this stage, having seen those few years from sort of the high water mark of 2016. I think we were all paying a lot more attention to and much more noticing how there was going to be this whole ecosystem of both paid and organic content on social media, which was pushing to discuss social issues in a way that was intended to have a democratic impact, whether on, an immediate election there and then, or in, garnering support towards a particular cause, whatever it might be. And I think that space is far more complicated, far harder to regulate for and to stay on top of, but was actually probably the more crucial and the more important, because the actual registered political parties have a credit card in country, have people in state. That wasn't so much the difficult step. It was getting that gray zone around, the legitimate right of organizations to speak about significant issues that are affecting society, versus when do you get into the space where organizations are being astroturfed or managed from overseas or managed from political perspectives but pretending not to be political, and those sorts of things. So yeah, it got really complicated from there on out.
Well, and it also got complicated there in Europe with the European Union because I will never forget having conversations with because there are parties that are European wide. And so they
Mm.
might be based in, let's say, Brussels and they want to run ads across the entire European Union. But because they were based in Brussels, they had to have a representative in every single country and a credit card in every single country. And they were just like, well, that's
Mhm.
just not how this works. But again, if our goal was to try to prevent foreign interference, not every country in Europe had laws against foreign funding of elections. And so we were
Mhm.
like, which one do you want us to do? Right. Like, and they'd be like, but we're good actors. Like, just put us on a list and then it's going to be
Yeah.
fine. And it's like, no, how do we scale that? Right. Like, I think
Yeah.
and I wanna talk about this a little bit around, like, the it all sounds fine in theory, but actually implementing this is so
Mm.
incredibly hard because of those edge cases you mentioned, but also there's not a readily available list of every single political candidate, political party, every government official, and what their social media accounts are. Like, there's no API or anything for us to tap into for all of that to even try to make sure that the actors we know of are following all of the transparency rules. Like, it's a lot of details and work that have to go into it that are actually quite complicated there in Europe. I mean, they're complicated everywhere around the world, but I think
Right.
particularly in Europe made it quite hard.
Yeah, and I think, this is just the inherent struggle and sort of dissonance between democratic processes and governance and so on that are complicated and hard and don't necessarily scale from or translate from one country to another. The way in which tech operates, always thinking about scale, always thinking about speed and the move fast break things mentality and so on, it's just directly in contradiction with how complicated and, non-scalable good governance, democratic principles. As you say, is there even a list of registered candidates? I can tell you, you can register to run as a candidate here in Ireland with, I think, your passport and a few €100. Like, you really, the methods for which you have a legitimate method in which you have legitimacy to participate in democratic processes varies massively from country to country as well. So I think that the challenge was both the structural, how do we actually build a process which works with all of this complexity, with all of the different democratic processes, with, as you say, so many edge cases, so many, what about this? There was so much structural complexity. And then there was also the cultural difference between legislators and officials who would really prefer that everything would just slow down, take your time. We need to think this through. We need to send this to a committee, etc. And the culture tech side, which was like, no, we got to get on with this. We just got to build something and let's just scale it and ship it and so on. And that cultural friction made it very hard to be stuck in the middle between them.
So let's go to today. So political ad transparency launches, Facebook does it, Google does
Yeah.
it, Twitter did it for Twitter. We won't even get into Twitter, but political advertising transparency, it was humming along for a while here, but it's now changed in Europe. Can you give us an overview of sort of what has changed and what has happened to political advertising in Europe?
Sure. So it mightn't hurt just for your listeners to quickly run through what it was that Meta launched. And again, as you say, it was pretty similar. The transparency process is required by other platforms as well. Snapchat is another one which does offer political advertising. So as I mentioned, the advertisers themselves, the person who's pushing the buttons has to be in country. The credit card payment method has to be in country. The page, the Instagram account or Facebook account, has to be checked and verified with a physical address, an email address associated with your domain, and a phone number. Basically, all of these things to make sure that the organization is who it says it is and it actually exists. And I can't set up 20 different organizations all from the same address and same phone number and so on. So you have to go through all of these steps as an advertiser, proving you are who you say you are. And then when you run the ad, you check a little box which added the paid for by disclaimer. And then your ads went into an ad library, which was online, and anybody, to me, journalists, regulators, anybody could go in, check this library, any ad which had run in the EU in the last 7 years. Actually, no, it was global, wasn't it? By the time, uh,
I mean, it was
I
available
think pretty
globally,
much in
but we
most
were
countries.
enforcing it. We were enforcing it in only, I mean, we ended up enforcing it in over 90 countries, I think, at some point in time,
Right.
but, like, it was certainly available globally. Yeah.
Yeah. So everything available in this library, like really incredible insights. If you're a researcher and so on, you can see the ads that we're running. You can see some element of who the ads were targeting by gender and age, and you could see brackets of how much was being spent on it. So really, really transparent, actually, extremely transparent to the extent that, like, if that was a commercial advertiser, they would be horrified that their competitors could see how much money they were spending and who they were targeting and so on. But honestly, I mean, not just because it's a product that I was involved in rolling out, but like, I thought it was great. I thought it was a really, really good product. It was a bit onerous to implement, whenever I would start working with a new client, pain in the ass getting it set up, you'd spend a few weeks going through all the authorization process. But then once you did so, and assuming that you were a legitimate organization operating within a single state, as you say, there's problems for cross state. Anyway, within a single state, you run your ads go into the library, and all good, right? Everybody's on an even playing field. Everyone can see everything else. The fast forward to 2025, the EU is finally going to implement regulation that came in 2024, the transparency and targeting of political advertising, the requirements of which map extremely closely to what we had done in the Meta political ad authorization process. It pretty much requires exactly what we had done, And I was never involved on the regulatory side of things at Facebook, but, my guessing is that the folks who were involved in, putting this together, they were talking to, bureaucrats and legislators and getting guidance on, what should we put in place in order to, preemptively be in line with legislation that was coming down the line. Honestly, looking at TTPA, the only sort of substantive difference was that it was going to not allow the sort of micro-targeting that Cambridge Analytica was famed for having done. So the targeting was going to have to be a lot broader. And actually, to this day, it seems there's some slightly differing perspectives in terms of what actual targeting you can or can't do. But, it's more sort of broad strokes targeting, no more micro-targeting and getting into people's brains with creepy ads. That's the legislation. The overlap with the Meta political ad authorization process, like, honestly, almost identical. The key difference with the TTPA, with the EU regulation, was that if a platform, not an advertiser, but the platform was found to be violating the TTPA, not, running ads that were not fully in line with the regulations, were not adequately, sorry, that again. That if a platform, the difference with the TTPA being that rather than an advertiser being found liable, if it found that a platform was in violation of the TTPA in some ways, in the, political ads were running that hadn't fully, declared who they were or hadn't placed the ads in the ad library and so on, then the platform would be in violation of the TTPA and the platform could be fined an absolutely huge amount, Katie. I don't recall the exact number. I think it's 6% of their revenue, total revenue. So we're talking billions of euros, billions. This was the difference between what Meta was doing with its own authorization process and the TTPA. The TTPA was basically saying, everything that you're doing is fine, but if you screw up, we're going to take 6 billion euros off you or something like this. Like such huge money that kind of, it ultimately felt like what's probably been going on for the last couple of years since the authorization process has been in place. All of us have been playing ball, going through the authorization, putting our ads in the library. That actually this has been about what level of punitive response the EU can and would have against the platform. We've seen there has been stronger will within the EU in the last little while to levy fines against Facebook, against Meta. They've been in the hundreds of millions rather than billions, but it's still pretty significant. And my bet is that what's been going on behind the scenes hasn't really been a challenge for Meta to, deliver the spirit of the TTPA, because that has actually been in place already for, 6 or more years. It's the threat of the fines. And that wasn't going away. So as of late July this summer, with the TTPA due to come into force in October, in late July, Meta announced that they were just going to ban political advertising. And when I say political, that's political and social issues advertising in the whole of the EU, effective from October. They're just not going to participate because the TTPA is too onerous. I'm not going to lie, from that point at the end of July and right up until October, I was still hoping somebody might blink. It felt like a standoff that, the EU had gone in so hard with this massive, massive fine, which, really there would be aghast if they were ever actually able to apply a fine like that. But anyway, it felt like a tough tactic. And the response from Meta was, well, we'll punch back then. So nobody blinked. You didn't change the legislation. It came into force on the 10th of October as originally drafted. And 4 days before that, Meta pulled the plug on basically any advertiser or any ad which previously in the past would have checked the little box and declared that it was a political ad and gone into the library. Those ads are now banned. The political ads library is gone, which previously was there with its 6+ years worth of historical data and so on.
But Meta did completely remove the library. I know Google did, but so you can't even with Meta go see the old ads?
For political ads, the political ads are gone. The library remains in as much as it did previously for non-political, for active ads. So if an ad is running right now on Facebook, you can still go to facebook.com/ads/library and you can see ads that are live right now, but with no requirement for them to stay there for 7 years as the previous library had in place. So,
but can I go back and see, can I go see ads from the 2019 UK election still in the library?
Well, UK is still there because UK, thank you, Brexit, is...
Sorry, UK is a bad example, but
TTPA.
the French election, well, that's also a bad example because they have a 3-month blackout. But you know what I'm trying to say.
Irish elections from last year are gone already. The Irish elections from 2020 are gone. Yeah, so it is a massive loss to researchers, to transparency activists, to journalists, to anybody who's interested in this. It is such a huge loss. The library, which existed until now, that's, a regressive step. The TTPA came into force with the intention of increasing transparency. And in fact, it's now a huge step backwards. And then, of course, for political advertisers or social issues advertisers, that means using ads on Meta is no longer possible at all if you are a good organization who does what you're meant to do, like a registered political party and so on. That's it. You can't run ads anymore. My and many others' concerns is that actually this does not stop any of the shady and dubious tactics which were the driving motivation for setting up the political authorization process to begin with. Any of the shady foreign interference stuff, the astroturfing and so on, that's just going to go underground now. And the activities that were at least taking place in the light of day, visible within the ad library and so on, all of that has stopped. The dark money will go underground. The algorithms on the non-paid basis are going to deliver the content of basically those who know how to game algorithms, which typically tend to be more extremist voices, whichever side of the divide it might be on. It's always the more shocking, more salacious, more outrageous content, which gets more distribution in the organic algorithm. And the more sort of call them vanilla, sort of, center left to center right, middle of the road, not amazingly exciting content that would have been a paid ad in the past. That's not possible anymore. So essentially all we have left then is the more extremist rhetoric, which is going to do well organically. So yeah, the objectives of the TTPA in terms of improving the political advertising space for people in Europe, actually the result has been we are worse off now in November 25, 2 months ago, with the previous Meta-led process.
If you could wave a magic wand, what would you do? Like, because it feels a bit, because on one hand, someone's going to be like, these big companies, Facebook, Google, they can afford like they should just do it. And if they do it right, then they're not going to get fined and they shouldn't worry about it. But I think also on the flip side to what you were saying about the regulator, like these fines are so massive that it's also like not just hurting the really big companies, but especially hurting medium to small size platforms that may also just be like, hey, it's not worth doing anything political and letting campaigns, which to your point just drives it more underground and makes everything less transparent. So what would you, if you were the ruler of the universe, what would you ask each side to change to bring us into an ideal situation?
Yeah. As I say, my feeling, and this is just as an observer, I've no insight into what's happening behind the curtains, but my assumption is that both sides are just digging their heels in at this point and refusing to budge. So I think the best thing I could do with a magic wand would be to just get them both to calm the hell down a little bit and get back to speaking to each other and find a compromise. Because this current situation with neither refusing to budge, this stalemate is just so harmful for everybody who's stuck in between. So that's for the public in Europe, it's for NGOs and organizations who campaign on social issues, who potentially are going to be, incapable of fundraising going forward. There's so many unintended sort of collateral damage elements to this. So the best magic wand would be to force them to sit back down at the table and find a compromise. As I say, I betcha it's the money is the primary reason. I have heard from folks at Meta, there's this whole, we couldn't put a product out there that didn't allow the targeting that we allow because we would never want to put a bad ad product out into the marketplace. I call bullshit on that, I'm afraid. There was an ad product being offered to anybody in the EU who wanted to pay to use Facebook so they didn't have to have targeted ads coming to them. So the product exists. Do we believe that targeted ads are a better experience? Yeah, I do. Like even for everything that has gone on, I do still think that people actually prefer targeted ads because then they're relevant to them rather than irrelevant ads. But the line from Meta that, it's because they couldn't possibly put out an ad product that doesn't have the range of targeting available to them, I think it's the money. Does the EU genuinely believe that it's ever going to fine and successfully recoup 6% of total revenue because of, somebody from Macedonia runs an ad and so like that? I just genuinely don't. I think it's a threat from the EU that I don't think they will ever actually follow through on. So is there space for negotiating on that? The ideal. Go on.
And go ahead. Keep going.
Please.
Well, I was going to ask because I think there's an element of this too that even when a Meta or a Google says that political ads are banned, I've read, you can tell me if this is true or not, but I know this happened in Washington State here in the United States where also political ads are banned, where people are still getting through the system because you still have to do the work of identifying these ads, whether you're banning them and not allowing them to run or you're trying to provide transparency for them. Like you still have to do the work if you're a company in which to do that, which is a challenge. I also want to add with my magic wand, I think you are right about Meta in Europe, not just Meta in Europe, but Meta and many governments. It's been a decade now of a lot of really tense conversations that have not been productive in any way, shape, or form. But I also think that one of the big things that has changed in the last 10 years is that you have people like you and me who are no longer inside the company, but can talk about these things more publicly. We can give people more context of what is happening. We can help also be at the table of talking about what some of these solutions could be because we have different incentives now because we are not inside the company having to represent them and their position, nor are we in the regulator, but we understand deeply the systems and everything that is at work here. And so I'm curious about what you've been very outspoken on this. That is not an easy thing in which to do and be public. What made you want to talk out about this more in Europe about the challenges that all of this is posing?
I mean, listen, full disclosure, it hurts my business, right? I run a consultancy and an ad agency for political campaigners. So that includes political parties, but it also includes nonprofit organizations who might be trying to run advocacy campaigns about sexual violence or to fundraise for homelessness or lobby the government and, these sorts of things. All of these organizations are getting shut down by this plan. So I want to try and be the voice for those legitimate advertisers, for those good organizations who are wanting to have a positive impact on people's social media feeds to be present in there. But I think even as a step beyond there, what I am really concerned about, and I think we all of us who have been paying attention to the rise of more extremist discourse on social media platforms. Again, we haven't gone near X, right? But I think many of us who have been on Facebook for a long time, we've been able to feel the atmosphere, starting to change a bit on Facebook. The way that algorithms reward engagement on content, regardless of the substance of that content, means that, as I was mentioning earlier, more extremist rhetoric will always do better. Algorithmically will always do well to, get eyeballs watching for longer and so on. And also the algorithm will also amplify echo chambers. If, I enjoy watching far left video content in my Facebook feed, I'm going to see more and more of that. I'm probably less likely to see the far right content, which, again, that suits my social media feed. It's not great for the echo chamber that it's creating for me, where I think everybody thinks the same way that I do and feels the same way. I think there is a massive, massive risk to social cohesion and social harmony by taking away the method for the more reasonable, moderate, middle of the road voices to reach people in social media. We still have people spending 2+ hours per day on social media. Here in Ireland, Facebook and Instagram are still by far the highest. And this is the spaces where people are spending their leisure time, their chill out space. We are basically, the situation with political advertising being removed means that the content that people will see in that 2 hours per day will only be the organic content which does well in the algorithm, which therefore means it's the more extremist, which therefore means the center voices, the counter voices from nonprofits that are speaking about, why immigrant centers shouldn't be burnt down by far right activists and so on. All of those voices are the ones being silenced. And I think there is a really genuinely profound risk to society by removing the space and the ability for moderate and counter voices to reach people. And that's basically what this ban has done.
Well, Claire, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Katie.
I want to thank Claire for joining me. It was a very fun conversation to kind of go back to the early days of Facebook, but also I think the challenges around everything that comes with political advertising. And I think the point that I just want to leave everybody with is about how this regulation that was meant to bring more transparency to ads has actually caused it to have less transparency there, which shows that there's just a lot more conversations that we need to be having about what it means to have transparency online when it comes to political advertising, what should be allowed when it comes to targeting and all of that. And that's a conversation that I'm excited to continue to have. Reminder that I write about a lot of this on my newsletter at anchorchange.substack.com. But until next time, thanks for joining us.